So as part of Civispedia, we'll be looking at 3 topics today. We'll be starting with the differences between wholesale price index and consumer price index. Then what exactly is Vikas Engine, as a recent test has been successfully conducted by the Defense Research and Development Organization. And under mains discussion, we'll be looking at the Women's Reservation Bill, like what exactly is the bill and what are the features of the bill and what are the possible hurdles in implementation of the bill. So we'll be starting with the differences between the wholesale price index and consumer price index for evaluating a country's inflation. Now, before we delve into the basics of economics, we need to understand the concept of inflation in the first place. So we'll start with a few basics. So what exactly is inflation? Now, to put it in very crude terms, inflation generally means price rise. So price has increased. Now you should ask the question, price has increased with respect to what? Like compared to maybe 2 years, 3 years. So compared to a specific year, let's just call it B, a year B. How much ever price has increased, price of a particular commodity has increased, that particular area is actually termed as inflation. If you take an example of bread, if it's costing maybe 20 rupees per packet, maybe 3 years earlier, and now it's costing 30 rupees, now you know that the price is actually increased by 50%. That concept is called as inflation. Now the reference year which you use for comparison right now, like we said 3 years ago, that is your base year. Now there are many technicalities for choosing a base year. Now, like the base year should be a normal economic year for a country. Like there should not be many diplomatic struggles between any other nation. There was proper rainfall in that particular time. There was no political turmoil. So that a normal year is considered as a base year, and that is used as a reference point from which price rise is calculated. Now you should ask the question, okay, why is inflation very important? Now to give you an example, if you read the most recent book by Ruchir Sharma, like which was released in 2016, The Rise and Fall of Nations, there is a specific chapter, the price of onions. So Ruchir Sharma goes to the extent of saying that inflation can determine whether as a political entity a nation can survive or not. You know, inflation kind of tells you how much savings is left with the most downtrodden population and people. If the price of the most basic commodities is going to increase in vast numbers when compared to a normal year, they will not have enough money to take care of their livelihood and their expenses, and hence the country crumbles as such. So in terms of economics, a slight amount of inflation is necessary so that your economy improves. At the same time, if you're going to have an enormous increase in inflation, it is going to affect the performance of the economy and of course the stability of a nation. Now to come to the different measures, that is the wholesale price index and the consumer price index, which are two different measures for calculating inflation in a country to determine whether, like, in what direction or prospects in which a country is progressing. Now, if you take wholesale price index, now why do we use the term wholesale? It's simply because it is large scale commodities. Like from a large vendor, one more vendor is actually buying a huge basket of commodities. That is what you call as wholesale. Now, if you look at consumer price inflation, it is the price of commodities which is sold in retail level. Like, people like you and me who go to a particular retail shop and buy a commodity. So the prices associated with the consumer, the direct consumer, is associated with consumer price index, and WPI is usually for large scale industries in which they buy goods and service goods in bulk. Now, if you look at the entity which is associated with publishing and calculating WPI, it is Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion, which is pretty much straightforward because this particular ministry, which comes under the Ministry of Commerce, this particular department, which comes under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, is well placed to analyze the whole production value of a large amount of commodities and assess whether the prices have increased or prices have risen over a base year. If you look at the organization which is involved in calculating CPI, it is Central Statistics Organization, which is again well placed under Ministry of Central Statistics Office, which is placed under Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, which has enough resources to go to multiple locations and evaluate how prices have risen. So logically speaking, you can make the connect that a wholesale price index, which is very much associated with industry, and bulk purchases comes under DIPP, which is Ministry of Commerce and Industry, and which is directly associated with consumer. You need a very resource-rich organization which can collect information from a large amount of places, and there your central statistics office comes in. Now, if you look at the components, like, okay, now we've said that you're talking about bulk purchases, but bulk purchases of what, or what type of commodities are we talking about? It is primarily three in case of WPI. That is manufactured products, primary articles, and fuel and power. Now, one important thing to note in case of WPI is that the manufactured products hold a larger share of the total calculation of WPI. It stands around 64%. Now, why it is important? It is important if you contrast it exactly with CPI. If you look at the components which are used for calculating CPI, you can clearly see that these are directly affecting the consumer, and most importantly, it involves services. Important services like health and education, and important commodities like food, beverages, housing, fuel and light, and clothing. So you could clearly see that the commodities or the entities which are used for calculating CPI is directly affecting the consumer, but WPI is more oriented towards the industry, and the fluctuating articles like fuel and power have a smaller share when compared to your manufactured products. Now we have understood that there are two different measures, but to look at which is more important in terms of monetary policy perspective, it is consumer price inflation. I think the reason is already explained in the previous slide, that most of the services which we see is directly associated with the consumer, and hence CPI is used by the Reserve Bank of India for envisioning their policy for the subsequent quarters and for adjusting their policy rate which controls the total money supply in the economy. So if they feel that the inflation is increasing, they control the money supply, and if they feel that there more activity needs to be done or there is not enough investment, they decrease the interest rate so that money supply is increased to people so that investment goes up. So that is the primary differences between WPI and CPI, and why CPI is used as a monetary policy perspective. Now, the second prelims topic is regarding the Vikas Engine. Now, ISRO has improved the thrust of the Vikas Engine. Now, this was the actual news article. So, what exactly is this Vikas Engine? It's a liquid-fueled rocket engine, and this particular engine powers all major satellite launch vehicles, right from our PSLV, GSLV, and GSLV Mark III. Now, before we go into the concept of directly jumping into satellite launch vehicles, you can simply use an analogy, like it's directly satellites launch vehicle, like your school bus which drops you at school. A satellite launch vehicle drops a satellite in its respective orbit. It's that simple. So all these major satellite launch vehicles of India uses this particular liquid fueled rocket engine. So in terms of improving efficiency, if you're able to improve this, what the experiment has been done is that they've improved the specific impulse or the thrust of this particular engine, which means all these satellite launch vehicles will have better capabilities, and they will be able to carry heavier payloads and heavier satellites to their respective orbits. So that is the significance of this particular Vikas engine. Now to come to the mains discussion on Women's Reservation Bill. Now this discourse on Women's Reservation Bill has been in the political arena for more than 20 years, and if you look at, it was passed as a constitutional amendment, 108th constitutional amendment in the year 2008, but back then the bill had to lapse because it was not passed by both houses of the parliament. Now, what exactly is the objective of the bill is, the bill aims to reserve 1/3 of all the seats in the Lok Sabha and the state legislative assemblies for women. And the second important feature is, it was not just as a whole 1/3, but it also provided for 1/3 reservation for women in both SCs and STs, a sub-reservation. And the bill went on to say that this particular reservation clause is applicable for 15 years. After that, there will be lapse of it, and the reservation is curtailed after that. So these were the primary features of the bill. Now we'll just proceed to look at what are the possible hurdles in implementation of the bill, in spite of the fact that there is so much support from many political parties in India. So if you look at the most important opposition, it comes from the implementation of women reservation in Panchayat Raj. Now in Panchayat Raj, we do have women reservation. The point is that in many cases, there are many instances in which, though women is the candidate who wins the election, she is not the one who is governing, but it is her husband who runs the local Panchayat body. So it is feared by parliamentarians that if women's reservation is brought up in parliament and state assemblies, this particular Panchayat Raj syndrome might enter into state legislative assemblies and the highest legislative authority in India. Secondly, on whether the reservation is a limitation or will it be an extension over reservation. To put it in numerics, like whether the 33% reservation is going to be a bar, or the women can even contest in seats which are not reserved for them. So there is still no proper clarity on this particular 33%. Like there are candidates, like right now the total percentage parliamentary representation of women in India is 11%. So there is so even without reservation, right now there is 11%. So if you're going to reserve for 33%, like will women be allowed to contest in constituencies which are not reserved for them? That particular issue still exists. And thirdly, OBC reservation. Now, if you looked at the previous features which we discussed in the previous slide, we talked about women reservation, that is a subcategorization of reservation in SCs and STs. But the question of OBC reservation is not addressed yet, and there are increasing claims for incorporating OBC reservation. And fourth is it diverts attention from larger issues. Now, one of the important issues which affects Indian parliamentary democracy is criminalization of politics and intra-party democracy, how within a party it functions. So, without changing the actual political dynamics, like incorporating women as administrators within a political party, it is pretty much not the right way to expect them to award reservation in the first place. So these are already areas which are affecting the representation of women in politics itself, which is again delaying the passage of the bill in the parliament. But in spite of these hurdles in implementation, there are a lot of positives which will come into play and important reasons why women's reservation bill should be taken into important context. First thing is, in spite of the fact that there are cases in which cases of Panchayati Raj syndrome in which the women is not leading the charge, there are many successful stories which have even won awards at the national level, which clearly show that if women are provided responsibility, they perform equally and many a times better than men. Secondly, one of the important reasons why many of the legislations and laws which is passed in India is accused of not being gender sensitive is because right now the representation of women is extremely less. So many important clauses are not gender sensitive. If women's reservation is provided and they are to represent like close to 1/3 of the actual strength of the parliament, then definitely legislation is expected to become more gender sensitive. And you know that like providing reservation immediately does not change the way women are being treated in India or elevate their status immediately. But in terms of polity, it is definitely the first step in empowerment, because legislatively and politically you're providing them power, and that itself is enabling a change. So even though that this particular reservation bill is not a silver bullet for tackling all the problems which women are facing in India, this definitely is the first step. Then there is one more concept of dual membership. Like if there is so much hurdles in implementation, one particular aspect which can be considered is dual membership of constituencies, in which you can have both a male and a female candidates representing a particular constituency. Now there are a lot of political issues and even numerics involved in that. If you're going to have dual membership constituencies for 1/3 reservation, the number of parliamentarians who are represented, of course, parliamentarians and state legislative members who are represented is going to increase drastically. So that is one issue we are going to deal with. And secondly, if you're going to have dual membership, then how will administration take place and who will take which responsibility? But if the implementation of 108 constitutional amendment is a hurdle, then maybe dual membership could be a stepping stone in which the total reservation could be achieved. So these are the parameters, the features of the Women's Reservation Bill, what are the hurdles in implementation, and one possible solution how we can tackle this particular issue. So as far as today's topics are concerned, these are the 3 areas which we have discussed. Thanks for your time.